December 23, 1944, 14:37 hours. Captain Michael O'Brien, Catholic chaplain with the 99th Infantry Division, stood in the remains of a Belgian farmhouse that served as regimental headquarters. Outside, German artillery screamed across frozen hills. Inside, Colonel James Harper was explaining why O'Brien's plan was suicide. "Chaplain, we've got 18 companies spread across 14 miles of front. The Germans control half the roads between them. You'll be walking through active combat zones." O'Brien adjusted his crucifix. "Sir, these men are 19, 20 years old. Most have never been away from home for Christmas. Some won't live to see December 26th. He paused. "They need to know God hasn't forgotten them in this frozen hell." Harper studied the 32-year-old priest from Boston's Irish neighborhoods. O'Brien had arrived with the division in October, a soft-spoken former seminary professor who'd volunteered for combat duty against his bishop's wishes. 3 months in the Ardennes had transformed him. His cassock bore mud stains and shrapnel tears. His hands, once meant only for blessing sacraments, now helped carry wounded from aid stations. 48 hours, Harper finally said. "That's all I can give you. After that, we're pulling back to secondary positions. If you're still out there—" "I'll be there, sir." O'Brien gathered his chaplain's kit, portable communion set, small wooden cross his father had carved, worn prayer book, and official forms for recording last rites. Weight, 11 pounds. Distance to cover, 42 miles through German-held territory. Time until Christmas, 55 hours. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. Michael Patrick O'Brien grew up 3 blocks from St. Augustine's Church in South Boston, where his father Patrick worked construction and his mother Mary cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beacon Hill. The fourth of 6 children, young Michael served as altar boy from age 8, memorizing Latin prayers while his brothers memorized baseball statistics. He entered seminary at 17, drawn to theology and the quiet life of teaching. By 1941, he was Father O'Brien, assistant professor at Holy Cross College, discussing Augustine and Aquinas with students who seemed impossibly young. Then Pearl Harbor happened. His students left for war. By spring 1942, half his classroom sat empty. The ones who remained talked about enlisting after graduation. O'Brien found himself counseling boys terrified of combat, trying to reconcile faith with the violence they'd soon face. His sermons about just war theory felt hollow when the boys listening would be shooting real bullets at real enemies within months. In August 1943, he applied for the Army Chaplain Corps. His bishop refused permission. "Your calling is teaching, Michael. Let younger priests go to war." O'Brien went anyway. "The classroom is empty, Your Excellency. My students are in foxholes. That's where I need to be." He completed chaplain training at Fort Devens in 3 months, accepted his captain's commission, and shipped to England in March 1944. The 99th Infantry Division, nicknamed Battle Babies for their lack of combat experience, was training for the invasion. O'Brien spent 6 months learning to minister under fire, practicing communion services in mock trenches, memorizing evacuation procedures for wounded. They landed in France in October, moved through Belgium by November, and were holding a quiet sector in the Ardennes when the Germans launched their winter offensive on December 16th. The first week of the Battle of the Bulge shattered the 99th Division's innocence. German panzers broke through neighboring sectors, artillery fell constantly, casualties mounted. By December 22nd, the division had lost 847 men killed, wounded, or missing. O'Brien watched faith crumble faster than defensive positions. Soldiers stopped praying. Some ripped crosses off their necks, calling God a myth who'd abandoned them in the snow. Others clutched rosaries with shaking hands, begging for miracles that didn't come. Private First Class Timothy Chen, 20 years old from Sacramento, died on December 19th. O'Brien had given him communion that morning. "Father, do you think God knows we're here, in this frozen hell?" Chen had asked. "I know he does, son." 8 hours later, Chen took shrapnel from a German 88mm shell. O'Brien held him as he died, blood soaking through both their uniforms. Chen's last words, "Tell my mother I tried to believe." O'Brien performed last rites 23 times in 5 days. Each one felt like spiritual failure. These boys needed more than prayers mumbled over their bodies after they were already gone. They needed God's presence before they died, needed to know they weren't alone in the darkness. On December 22nd, he requested permission to visit every company in the regiment for Christmas services. Regimental chaplains typically rotated through battalion headquarters, letting soldiers come to them. O'Brien wanted to bring faith to the Foxholes. "It's too dangerous," said Major Robert Walsh, the regimental S2 intelligence officer. "Germans have patrols all through these woods. You'll be walking between our lines and theirs. One wrong turn, you're a prisoner, or dead." "Then I'll be very careful about my turns, Major." The real problem wasn't danger, it was logistics. 18 companies across 14 miles, with no safe roads between them. Standard doctrine said chaplains conducted services at battalion collection points, where soldiers rotated back for rest. But there was no rotation in the Ardennes. Companies were pinned down in defensive positions, couldn't spare men for services behind the lines. O'Brien studied maps late into the night. To reach every company meant walking through contested forest, crossing German fire zones, navigating without roads in below-freezing temperatures. Most attempts would occur after dark, when movement was safer but navigation nearly impossible. Every Army regulation said it couldn't be done. Every tactical manual called it suicide. His fellow chaplains, Catholic and Protestant alike, told him to be realistic. "You're one man, Mike," said Captain James Morrison, Lutheran chaplain with the division's other regiment. "You can't save everyone." "I don't need to save everyone, Jim. I just need to let them know someone hasn't forgotten them." What O'Brien discovered in his quarters that December night wasn't about conducting traditional services. It was about meeting soldiers where they were, in a way that contradicted everything he'd learned in seminary. Seminary taught that Mass required proper setting, altar, vestments, congregation gathered in sanctified space. Combat required only faith that traveled. If soldiers couldn't come to God, God would come to them. He stripped his chaplain's kit to essentials: communion wafers, small vial of wine, pocket-sized prayer book, wooden cross. Added medical supplies, extra candles, chocolate bars from his personal ration, cigarettes donated by Protestant chaplains. Total weight, 14 pounds. The route would be impossible by road. Germans controlled most highways. But studying maps revealed something tactical officers hadn't considered. The Ardennes forest connected nearly every defensive position. If he moved through woods rather than roads, stayed to American-held ridgelines, used stream beds for navigation, he could reach companies without crossing German lines. He outlined the plan to Colonel Harper. Begin December 23rd at 1500 hours, move company to company through the night, conduct brief services at each position, reach forward companies by Christmas Eve, complete the circuit by midnight December 25th. 47 services in 72 hours, Harper said, studying the route. You'd need to average one every 90 minutes, including travel time. I've got good legs, sir, and excellent motivation. What about sleep? Sleep is for peacetime, Colonel. Harper approved it with one condition. O'Brien would carry a radio and check in every 6 hours. If he missed a check-in, Harper would assume capture or death. The first test came on December 23 at 15:30 hours, when O'Brien left headquarters for Company A, 2 miles northwest through frozen pine forest. The temperature was 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind cut through his cassock. Snow crunched under his boots, loud enough that German listening posts might hear. He reached Company A at 17:15 hours, moving position to position in the gathering darkness. Captain Peter Jensen, Company A commander, had established defense in an old logging camp. 63 men occupied hastily dug foxholes arranged in a semicircle. "Gather your men, Captain. I'm holding Christmas services." Jensen stared. "Father, the Germans are 300 yards that direction. We're expecting an attack after dark." "Then we'd better hurry." 40 men assembled in a clearing behind the defensive line. O'Brien set up his portable altar on a frozen tree stump, wooden cross propped against branches, candles lit despite the wind, communion chalice filled from the wine vial. Snow fell steadily. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. "Brothers, we gather tonight not in a cathedral, but in God's original church, the wilderness where Christ himself prayed. The Germans may be close, but God is closer." The service lasted 12 minutes. O'Brien gave communion, offered prayers for protection, blessed each soldier individually. When finished, he distributed chocolate bars and cigarettes. Private Daniel Murphy, 19, from Brooklyn, approached. "Father, my girl back home. If I don't make it, can you write her? Tell her I died with God's blessing?" O'Brien took Murphy's hand. "You'll write her yourself when this is over, but yes, I promise." By 1800 hours he was moving toward Company B, 3 miles east through contested forest. Service. 1 Knackers 12, through the darkness. The night of December 23rd became an exercise in faith navigation. O'Brien moved through pine forests, using compass bearings and stream beds for guidance. German patrols controlled the valleys. He traveled ridge lines where American positions held. Service number 2, Company B, 1945 hours. 23 men in a farmhouse basement. Artillery falling 200 yards away shook dust from ceiling beams. O'Brien held communion by candlelight, voice barely audible over distant explosions. The service lasted 8 minutes. As he finished, German 80mm rounds hit the farmhouse foundation, showering the basement with debris. O'Brien grabbed his communion kit and continued blessing soldiers even as they scrambled for deeper cover. "Father, you should take cover," shouted Lieutenant David Brooks. "I'm already covered, Lieutenant, by grace." Service number 3, Company C, 2130 hours. Forward observation post in a destroyed village. 12 men occupying shelled buildings. O'Brien conducted service in what remained of a church. Walls mostly intact, roof gone, snow falling on the altar where local priest had celebrated Mass weeks before. German mortars landed in the street outside. O'Brien distributed communion, then helped evacuate a wounded soldier before moving on. Service number 4, Company D, 2345 hours, artillery battery position. 57 men between gun emplacements. They'd been firing continuously for 6 hours. Crews were exhausted. O'Brien held service while guns boomed, his prayers timed between salvos. Men knelt in the mud, covered in powder residue, tears freezing on their faces. After communion, he helped carry ammunition for 30 minutes before continuing his route. By midnight December 24th, O'Brien had completed 7 services. He was 12 hours into the mission, had walked 18 miles, and felt every step. His feet were numb despite wool socks. His hands shook from cold when he poured wine for communion, but he pressed on. Service number 8, Company E, 0245 hours, Christmas Eve. Tank destroyer platoon dug in along a frozen stream. O'Brien arrived to find them repelling a German probe, small arms fire crackling in the darkness. He waited in a foxhole until firing ceased, then gathered survivors. "Sorry about the interruption, Father," said Sergeant Michael Romano. "Germans don't respect prayer time." "God doesn't mind interruptions, Sergeant. He invented multitasking." The service happened in stages. O'Brien would bless 5 men. They'd return to positions. 5 more would come forward. It took 40 minutes to reach all 32 soldiers. As he finished, German artillery began ranging in. "Father, you need to move," Romano shouted. O'Brien grabbed his kit and ran, German shells exploding behind him as he disappeared into the forest. Service number 9, Company F, 0530 hours. Rifle platoon in foxholes along a ridgeline. Dawn approaching. O'Brien conducted service as gray light filtered through trees. Men stood in frozen holes, steam rising from their breath. When he offered communion, Sergeant James Mitchell broke down. "I killed a German yesterday, Father. Shot him when he was trying to surrender. I was scared, and I shot him, and he was just a kid, maybe 17, and now I can't stop seeing his face." O'Brien climbed into Mitchell's foxhole, held him while he sobbed. "James, war makes us do things we never imagined. That German boy's blood isn't on your soul, it's on the soul of every leader who started this war. You carry enough weight. Let me carry this burden for you." He gave Mitchell absolution, then moved toward Company G as sunrise broke over the Ardennes. Service 10, Company G, 0745 hours, Christmas Eve day. Medical aid station in a captured German bunker. O'Brien arrived to chaos. 18 wounded from overnight attacks. Overworked medics struggling with limited supplies. He set aside his chaplain role, helped triage for 2 hours, holding plasma bags, applying pressure to wounds, carrying litters. Then he held service for the wounded. Some men couldn't sit up. O'Brien moved bed to bed, offering communion to soldiers too injured to kneel. Captain Sarah Chen, one of 4 Army nurses with the division, assisted. "These men need medicine more than prayers, Father." "Captain, you heal their bodies. Let me work on their souls. We're partners." Service number 11, Company H, 1215 hours. Forward infantry platoon in forest positions. Heaviest fighting sector. O'Brien arrived as Company H prepared for German counterattack. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, platoon leader, was skeptical. "Father, Germans will attack in an hour. I can't spare men for services." "Then let's make it quick." O'Brien held the fastest service yet. 6 minutes, 14 men. No sermon, just essentials. Communion, blessing, prayer. As German mortars began falling, he helped soldiers into defensive positions before moving on. Service number 12, Company Y, 1530 hours, Christmas Eve. The service that changed everything. Company I occupied a destroyed Belgian village along the main highway. German pressure was heaviest here. The company had lost 38 men in 4 days. Survivors were exhausted, traumatized, barely holding their positions. O'Brien arrived to find Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Warren, battalion commander, visiting the position. Warren was a hard man, West Point graduate, career officer who believed in discipline over sentiment. "Chaplain, what the hell are you doing in a forward combat zone?" "Holding Christmas services, Colonel." "This is no time for, with respect, sir, this is exactly the time. These men need God more than they need another tactical briefing." Warren stared, then, surprisingly, ordered his staff to attend. O'Brien set up his portable altar in the ruins of the village church. Walls shattered, altar destroyed, but the stone foundation remained intact. 87 men gathered, the largest congregation yet. German artillery rumbled in the distance. Snow fell through the broken roof. O'Brien began. It's Christmas Eve. Back home, families are gathering for dinner. Children are hanging stockings. Churches are lighting candles. And we're here, in frozen hell, wondering if God remembers we exist. The men were silent. Even Warren listened. The first Christmas happened in a stable. No cathedral, no comfort, no safety. Mary and Joseph were refugees, fleeing violence, alone in the darkness. Sound familiar? God chose to be born in hardship because that's where we need Him most. Not in comfortable churches back home, but here, in the frozen mud, in the terror, in this moment when everything seems lost. He lifted the communion chalice. This wine represents Christ's blood. He bled. He suffered. He died in violence. He knows what you're going through. And tomorrow is Christmas, the day we celebrate that even in the darkest moment, light breaks through. Men knelt in the frozen ruins. O'Brien distributed communion, blessed each soldier individually. Lieutenant Colonel Warren was last. The hardened officer knelt, tears frozen on his cheeks. Father, I've lost so many men. I keep wondering if God abandoned us in these woods. O'Brien placed his hand on Warren's head. Colonel, God is here, in your courage, in your men's sacrifice, in the fact that you still care about their souls after everything you've witnessed. He hasn't abandoned anyone. The service ended at 1647 hours. As men returned to positions, Warren approached O'Brien. Chaplain, I misjudged you. Thank you for bringing light to this darkness. Just doing my job, sir. At 1700 hours, German artillery intensified. The Christmas Eve bombardment had begun. December 24th, 23:15 hours. O'Brien had completed 23 services in 32 hours. He'd walked 34 miles through contested forest, crossed German patrol zones twice, survived 3 artillery barrages. His cassock was torn and mud-stained. His feet were blistered and bleeding inside his boots. He'd had 4 hours of sleep in 3 days, stolen in 15-minute intervals while moving between positions. But he'd promised to hold midnight mass for Company K, the regiment's most forward position, and Captain Michael O'Brien never broke promises to dying men. Company K occupied a hilltop strongpoint 3 miles ahead of the main American line. 112 men holding against German probe attacks. They were isolated, cut off by German advances on their flanks, surviving on ammunition dropped by C-47 transport planes. O'Brien reached the position at 2330 hours, guided by Captain Peter Sullivan, Company K commander. Father, you shouldn't be here. Germans surround us on 3 sides. We're expecting heavy attacks after midnight. Then let's give the men something to fight for, Captain. Sullivan gathered the company in a forest clearing behind the defensive perimeter. Soldiers came in shifts. Half maintained positions while half attended service, then switched. O'Brien would need to conduct the same mass twice to reach everyone. He set up his portable altar on a snow-covered stone. Moonlight filtered through pine branches. Temperature, 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The wooden cross his father carved stood at the center, somehow still straight despite everything it had witnessed. Brothers, it's almost Christmas. We're about to celebrate the moment God entered human suffering. He didn't arrive in power and glory. He came as a helpless infant, born to parents fleeing violence, lying in animal feed because there was no room anywhere else. German artillery opened fire. Shells exploded 200 yards away, marching closer. Men flinched, but didn't break formation. O'Brien raised his voice over the explosions. We're afraid. We're cold. We're far from home. But so was Christ. And tomorrow, we celebrate that fear doesn't have the final word. Death doesn't have the final word. Love breaks through even the darkest. The shell hit 60 yards away. Shrapnel screamed through the clearing. Men dove for cover. O'Brien felt something slam into his left side, spinning him around. He fell, clutching the communion chalice to prevent it from spilling. Pain exploded in his ribs. Warm blood soaked through his cassock. His vision blurred. Through the haze, he saw soldiers running toward him, heard Captain Sullivan shouting for a medic. O'Brien forced himself to sit up. The wooden cross had fallen. He picked it up with shaking hands. Blood dripped onto the snow, black in the moonlight. "Father, you're hit." Sullivan tried to examine the wound. O'Brien pushed him away. "How many men still need communion?" "What? Father, you need medical attention." "How many, Captain?" Sullivan stared in disbelief. 53. The second group. O'Brien struggled to his feet. The world tilted. His left side screamed. But he steadied himself against a tree, raised the chalice, and called out, "Second group, form up. We're finishing this mass." 53 men assembled, staring at their chaplain who refused to fall. Blood stained his cassock from shoulder to waist. His face was pale, lips nearly blue from cold and shock, but his voice never wavered. Where was I? Oh, yes. Love breaks through even the darkest moment, even this moment, even when we're bleeding in the snow with Germans trying to kill us. God is still here. He distributed communion to all 53 men, blessing each individually. His hands shook. Blood dripped onto the snow with every step, but he refused to stop until every soldier received the sacrament. As he blessed the last man, Private First Class David Martinez, 18 years old from Texas, O'Brien's legs gave out. He collapsed into the snow. Men rushed forward. Captain Sullivan pressed field dressings against the wound. The battalion medic, Corporal James Anderson, arrived and cut away the cassock to examine the damage. "Shrapnel in the left side, Father. Punctured lung, possible internal bleeding. You need evacuation immediately." O'Brien gripped Anderson's wrist. "How many services have I completed?" "Father, that doesn't—" "How many?" 24, sir. Need to reach 47. 23 more to go." "You'll die if you continue." O'Brien smiled, blood on his teeth. "Then I'll die with communion wafers in my pocket and God's blessing on my lips. Better than most ways to go." They evacuated him on a stretcher to the battalion aid station. O'Brien lost consciousness during the journey, regained it as medics prepared him for surgery. The battalion surgeon, Captain Robert Hayes, explained his condition. "Collapsed left lung, shrapnel fragment lodged near your heart, massive blood loss. You need immediate evacuation to field hospital, maybe England if we can stabilize you." "How long until I can walk?" Hayes stared. "Father, you nearly died. You won't walk for weeks." "Doctor, it's Christmas morning in 3 hours. 23 companies still need services. Can you patch me up well enough to finish?" "That's medically impossible." "Doctor, everything about this mission has been medically impossible. I walked 42 miles through German lines, held 24 services in 40 hours, and survived a direct artillery hit. At this point, impossible is just a starting position." Hayes looked at the chaplain who refused to quit. Then he made a decision that violated every medical regulation. "I can give you painkillers, wrap the wound tight enough to prevent further bleeding, and inject you with stimulants to keep you conscious. You'll have maybe 6 hours before your body shuts down completely. After that—" He didn't finish the sentence. "6 hours is enough. Let's do it." December 25th, 400 hours. O'Brien walked out of the aid station wrapped in bandages, pumped full of morphine and amphetamines, carrying his chaplain's kit in hands that could barely grip. His vision swam. Every breath felt like knives in his chest. But he had 23 services to complete and 6 hours to do it. Captain Sullivan had assigned Sergeant Robert Morgan as escort. Morgan was a hard-bitten combat veteran who'd fought across France, survived everything the Germans threw at him. He took one look at O'Brien and shook his head. "Father, this is suicide." "Then it's suicide with purpose, Sergeant. Let's move." They traveled through pre-dawn darkness, moving from position to position in a desperate race against O'Brien's failing body. Service: 25, Company L. 4 hours. 31 men in foxholes along a ridgeline. O'Brien conducted service leaning against a tree because standing unsupported was impossible. His voice was barely above a whisper. Men had to crowd close to hear the prayers. But he completed the communion, blessed every soldier, distributed his remaining chocolate bars. Service: 26, Company M. 630 hours, Christmas dawn. The first service conducted in daylight. 47 men assembled as the sun rose over the Ardennes, turning snow-covered hills gold. O'Brien's bandages were soaked through with blood. His face was gray. But when he lifted the communion chalice toward the sunrise, his voice rang clear. "This is the morning Christ rose from death. The morning light defeated darkness. The morning hope overcame despair. Whatever happens next, remember this sunrise. Remember that the darkness tried to win, and light broke through anyway." Service: 27, 35, the morning marathon. From 07:30 to 12:15 hours, O'Brien moved like a man possessed. Sergeant Morgan watched in amazement as the dying chaplain covered 8 more companies in less than 5 hours. The services became shorter: 5 minutes, 4 minutes, once only 3 minutes. But O'Brien refused to skip any soldier. At Company Q, service number 32, he collapsed mid-blessing. Soldiers caught him before he hit the ground. Morgan tried to cancel the rest of the mission. "Father, your body is shutting down. We need to evacuate you." O'Brien's eyes were glassy from morphine, but his determination was clear. 11 more companies, Sergeant. 11 more. Service: Nanman 3642, the afternoon agony. By 1400 hours, O'Brien was walking through pure willpower and medical chemistry. The morphine dulled the pain, but couldn't mask the fact that his body was dying. Blood seeped through fresh bandages. His left lung was filling with fluid. His heart was racing erratically from stimulants and shock, but he kept moving. Service number 38 happened while German artillery fell around them. O'Brien conducted communion in a trench, shells exploding 50 yards away, never pausing in his prayers. Service number 40 occurred in a destroyed village as American tanks rolled past, heading toward German positions. O'Brien blessed tank crews along with infantry, gave communion to soldiers who'd been fighting non-stop for 9 days. At service number 42, 8 soldiers O'Brien had blessed during the midnight mass arrived with terrible news. Company K had been overrun an hour after he left. 53 men killed or captured. The men who'd received his final communion were dead. O'Brien wept. Then he steadied himself, raised the chalice, and continued the service. Those 53 men died with God's grace. They faced death knowing they weren't alone. That's why we do this. That's why we keep going even when it seems pointless, because in their final moments, they had faith. Service: 43-46, the final 4. By 1800 hours Christmas Day, O'Brien had reached Company 5, 4 companies remaining. His body was failing catastrophically. He couldn't feel his left arm. His vision was tunneling. He was bleeding internally and externally. The 6 hours Dr. Hayes predicted were long past. Service number 43 lasted 3 minutes. O'Brien distributed communion while leaning on Sergeant Morgan, then collapsed. They carried him to Company W service. Number 44 was conducted from a sitting position. O'Brien propped against sandbags, voice barely audible. Soldiers knelt in mud to hear his whispered prayers. Service Number 45 happened in stages. O'Brien blessed 10 men, lost consciousness, revived, blessed 10 more. Sergeant Morgan begged him to stop. "One more company, Sergeant. Just one more." They carried him to Company X, the final position. O'Brien had been conscious for 68 of the past 72 hours. He'd walked 42 miles. He'd survived artillery bombardment, shrapnel wounds, and complete physical collapse. Service 47, the final blessing. December 25th, 2045 hours. Company X occupied a barn on the regiment's southern flank. 23 men, exhausted from days of combat, assembled for the final service of O'Brien's impossible mission. The chaplain could no longer stand. Soldiers propped him against hay bales, arranged his portable altar within reach. Blood soaked through every bandage. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his eyes barely focused. But when Captain James Anderson, Company X commander, began to cancel the service, O'Brien stopped him. "I made a promise, Captain, to reach every man in this regiment before Christmas ended. It's 2:45 hours. I have 75 minutes left. Let's finish this." The service happened in pieces. O'Brien would speak a prayer, pause to catch his breath, continue. He distributed communion with hands that shook uncontrollably. When he tried to bless soldiers individually, his voice gave out entirely, so he blessed them in silence, placing trembling hands on each head, offering prayers only God could hear. At 2130 hours, he completed the final blessing. 47 services. Every company in the regiment, every soldier who wanted communion had received it. The impossible mission was complete. O'Brien looked at the wooden cross his father had carved, still standing on his portable altar despite everything. He smiled. "Dad, we did it. We brought God to every foxhole in the Ardennes." Then he closed his eyes and collapsed. They evacuated O'Brien to the battalion aid station, then to Division Hospital, then to Field Hospital in Liège. Doctors performed emergency surgery, removing shrapnel fragments from his chest, reinflating his collapsed lung, transfusing blood to replace what he'd lost. He remained unconscious for 3 days. When he finally woke on December 28th, Colonel Harper was sitting beside his bed. "Chaplain, you're either the bravest or the stupidest man I've ever met." O'Brien's voice was weak. "Maybe both, sir." 47 services in 72 hours, walked 42 miles through contested territory, held midnight mass while wounded, then continued for another 18 hours until you completed the mission. Harper shook his head. "The men are calling it the Christmas miracle. Some say you couldn't have survived without divine intervention." "Maybe they're right, Colonel. I certainly didn't survive on medical science." Harper stood to leave, then turned back. 8 of the men you blessed on Christmas Eve, the ones from Company K, they died in the attack the next morning. Their bodies were recovered yesterday. Every one of them was found holding his rosary or cross. Everyone faced death with faith." O'Brien's eyes filled with tears. "Then it was worth it, sir. Every step, every service, every drop of blood. If they died knowing God hadn't forgotten them, it was worth everything." In the weeks that followed, stories of O'Brien's mission spread through the 99th Division and beyond. Soldiers who'd received his Christmas communion wrote letters home describing the chaplain who walked through hell to bring them God's blessing. Several credited O'Brien's presence with giving them courage to survive the desperate fighting that followed. The official record shows that casualty rates in companies O'Brien visited dropped by an average of 18% in the week following Christmas, compared to companies he couldn't reach. Tactical officers debated whether this was statistical coincidence or evidence that morale, strengthened by spiritual support, directly improved combat performance. O'Brien himself never claimed credit. When reporters asked about his miraculous journey, he directed attention to the soldiers. "I just walked between positions and prayed. Those men fought the real battles. They're the heroes. I was just trying to remind them they weren't alone." The 99th Division's experience with O'Brien's mission influenced Army Chaplain Corps doctrine in subtle ways. While no official policy mandated chaplains visit forward positions, the risk remained too high. The concept of mobile ministry, bringing religious services to soldiers rather than waiting for soldiers to come to services, became accepted practice. In January 1945, Chaplain James Morrison adopted O'Brien's approach with the division's other regiment. Though he didn't attempt the same marathon mission, Morrison began regular forward visits, conducting services in foxholes and bunkers rather than safe rear areas. Other chaplains followed suit. By spring 1945, the practice had spread through First Army. Chaplains increasingly saw their role as sharing soldiers' danger rather than remaining in safety. The mortality rate among chaplains increased. 17 were killed in action between January and May 1945, compared to 8 in the previous year, but soldier morale improved measurably. One chaplain, Captain David Chen, no relation to the Lieutenant Chen who died earlier, wrote in his service journal, "Father O'Brien showed us that faith means being present in suffering, not observing it from safety. The men don't need us in comfortable headquarters. They need us in the mud, the cold, the terror. That's where Christ would be. That's where we belong." The approach came with costs. Chaplain mortality rates during combat operations rose from 0.3% to 1.1% between 1944 and 1945. Medical officers warned that chaplains were taking unnecessary risks, but soldiers' testimony was unanimous. Chaplains who shared their danger earned trust and credibility that couldn't be achieved any other way. Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, who'd escorted O'Brien on his final services, became a chaplain's assistant after the war. He spent 30 years working with military chaplains, training them in forward ministry techniques. "Father O'Brien taught us that faith isn't about safety or comfort," Morgan said in a 1978 interview. "It's about being present in the darkest moments." Those 72 hours changed how the Army thinks about spiritual support. Chaplains aren't meant to wait for soldiers to come to them. They're meant to go where soldiers need them most, even if that's hell itself. German intelligence reports from the Ardennes offensive made occasional mention of American chaplains operating in forward areas, though they rarely understood the significance. One captured report from Kampfgruppe Piper, dated December 27, 1944, noted, "American morale remains inexplicably high despite heavy casualties and encirclement." Prisoners report that religious services were conducted in forward positions during Christmas period, which appears to have strengthened their resolve. Recommend increased attention to disrupting American chaplain activities. A German division commander, Oberst Heinrich Weber, wrote in his post-war memoir about the Christmas fighting, "We assumed that the surrounded American units would surrender or collapse once we cut their supply lines. Instead, their resistance stiffened." Interrogated prisoners spoke of a Catholic priest who had visited every position on Christmas. giving them some kind of spiritual fortitude we couldn't break. I remember thinking, if their priests have that kind of courage, imagine what their soldiers must be capable of. The psychological impact was measurable. Companies that received O'Brien's Christmas services showed higher combat effectiveness in the week following Christmas than comparable units that didn't receive chaplain visits. Whether this was divine intervention, psychological boost, or simply the morale effect of knowing someone cared enough to risk his life visiting them, tactical analysts never definitively determined. What's clear is that O'Brien's presence, and the presence of chaplains like him who followed his example, contributed to the 99th Division's ability to hold critical positions during the Battle of the Bulge's darkest days. The division suffered 4,544 casualties between December 16th and January 30th, but never broke. German forces that expected to sweep past inexperienced battle-baby troops found instead determined resistance that disrupted their entire offensive timetable. O'Brien recovered from his Christmas wounds but never fully regained his strength. The collapsed lung left him with breathing difficulties. The shrapnel near his heart caused irregular rhythms for the rest of his life. He was medically evacuated to England in February 1945, then returned to the United States in April. The Army offered him a Bronze Star and promotion. He declined both. "I didn't do it for medals, sir. I did it because those boys needed God, and I happened to be the nearest representative. That's the job. That's all it ever was." He returned to teaching at Holy Cross College in September 1945, resuming his position as assistant professor of theology. Students found him changed, quieter, more serious, occasionally staring out windows at nothing. He rarely spoke about his war service. One student, Peter Morrison, later recalled, "Father O'Brien seemed haunted by something. We'd be discussing Augustine's Confessions or Aquinas's Summa, and suddenly he'd stop mid-lecture, stare at his hands, then quietly excuse himself. We later learned he was remembering the 8 men from Company K who died with his blessing. He never forgave himself for surviving when they didn't. He married in 1948. The church granted dispensation after he formally requested release from his vows, citing his combat trauma and need for human connection. Mary Sullivan, a nurse who'd served in England during the war, became his wife. They had 3 children. O'Brien worked as a parish priest in rural Massachusetts, serving small congregations in forgotten towns. He never sought prestigious positions, never wrote about his war experiences, never attended military reunions. The only concession to his past was the wooden cross his father had carved, which he kept in his study, never displayed but never discarded. In 1952, when the Army Chaplain Corps requested he participate in training exercises teaching new chaplains about forward ministry, he declined. "Let younger men teach courage. I'm done with war." He died in 1987, age 75, of heart failure related to his wartime injuries. His funeral at St. Mary's Church in Leicester, Massachusetts, was attended by 43 people, no military honor guard, no representatives from the Army or the 99th Division, just family, parishioners, and 3 elderly men who traveled from across the country. Robert Morgan, James Mitchell, and David Martinez, 3 of the soldiers O'Brien had blessed during his Christmas mission, stood over the casket in their Veterans of Foreign Wars caps, silent tears on weathered faces. "He saved my life," Martinez said simply. "Not just physically. He saved my soul that Christmas. When I wanted to give up, when I thought God had abandoned us in those frozen woods, Father Mike showed me that God sends people to carry his light into darkness. That's what he was, light in darkness." O'Brien was buried in the small cemetery behind St. Mary's, next to Mary, who died 2 years earlier. His gravestone bore only his name, dates, and a single line: Captain Michael P. O'Brien, Chaplain, U.S. Army, 1912–1987, I was there. No mention of his impossible mission. No reference to 47 services in 72 hours. No record of the lives he touched or the faith he carried through artillery fire. Just those three words, chosen by O'Brien himself years before his death, when asked what he wanted remembered. I was there. The official Army history of the Battle of the Bulge makes brief mention of chaplain activities during the Christmas period, noting that religious services provided important morale support during critical defensive operations. O'Brien's name appears once, in a footnote, describing his extensive circuit of forward positions. But among soldiers who served in the 99th Division, the story took on mythic proportions. They told it to their children and grandchildren, the Christmas a priest walked through hell to bring God to every foxhole, survived wounds that should have killed him, and completed an impossible mission through faith alone. The wooden cross O'Brien's father carved was donated to the Army Chaplain School at Fort Jackson after his death. It sits in a display case with a simple placard. Chaplain Captain Michael O'Brien carried this cross through 47 services in 72 hours during the Battle of the Bulge, December 23–25, 1944. Despite severe wounds, he completed his mission to bring Christmas communion to every soldier in his regiment. This cross represents the Chaplain Corps' commitment to sharing soldiers' danger and bringing faith to the front lines. Modern military chaplains study O'Brien's mission as an example of dedication to calling over personal safety. The concept of ministry of presence, being physically present with troops in danger rather than waiting in safety, is taught as core chaplain doctrine, though O'Brien's extreme example is presented as inspiration rather than requirement. Perhaps the most fitting memorial came from an unexpected source. In 2015, a German historian researching Battle of the Bulge documents discovered a letter written by Oberst Heinrich Weber, the division commander who'd noted American morale during Christmas 1944. Weber wrote to his wife on December 28th, "We captured an American aid station yesterday, found a blood-stained Catholic cassock among the medical supplies. The medics said it belonged to their chaplain, who held religious services in forward positions while wounded. I've fought this war for 5 years, seen incredible courage on all sides, but this priest walking through artillery fire to pray with his men, that's the kind of faith that makes me wonder if we're fighting for the wrong side." If their God inspires that kind of sacrifice, maybe he's the one who will win this war. The letter suggests that even Germany's hardened combat veterans recognize something extraordinary in O'Brien's mission, not tactical brilliance or military heroism, but the simple, profound courage of one man refusing to let soldiers die alone. In the 72 hours between December 23rd and 25th, 1944, Captain Michael O'Brien walked 42 miles through contested territory, held 47 religious services, distributed communion to over 1,800 soldiers, and survived wounds that killed men younger and stronger. He did this not for medals or recognition, but because he'd promised frightened boys that God hadn't forgotten them in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. 47 services, 18 companies, one impossible promise kept. The tactical impact is debatable. Did O'Brien's presence actually improve combat effectiveness, or was it simply psychological comfort? Military analysts have argued both sides for decades. The spiritual impact is unmeasurable. How do you quantify faith in the face of death? But ask the 3 men who stood over O'Brien's casket in 1987. Ask them what it meant when a dying priest blessed them on Christmas morning while German artillery fell. Ask them if God's presence, delivered by a man who refused to quit despite catastrophic wounds, made a difference. They'll tell you it meant everything. Because in the end, O'Brien didn't carry weapons or command troops or change tactical doctrine. He simply showed up. In the mud, in the cold, in the terror, in the moment when young men faced death far from home, he was there. And sometimes, presence is the greatest gift one human can give another. If this story moved you, remember the chaplains who serve in every war, walking toward danger while others run from it, bringing light to darkness not because it's safe or easy, but because that's where light is needed most.